On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Barr Moses. She is the co-founder of Monte Carlo, and we're going to be talking about what data observability means. We're going to be talking about how data downtime impacts your team and also organizing your team, right? We're going to talk about how, central versus embedded. We're going to try to jam as much as we can. She's an amazing person to talk on these subject areas, and hopefully we can get all this in. Barr, I appreciate you being on.
Awesome being here.
Absolutely. So can do justice to your background. So if you could, let everyone know who you are and what Monte Carlo does, and we'll dive right in.
Yeah, absolutely. So Monte Carlo is a data reliability platform. So we work with organizations to help them accelerate the adoption of data by reducing what we call data downtime. I'll talk a little bit about that later, but it has a lot to do with data trust. And, I've worked with data organizations or companies generally in the last, decade or so. And what I've noticed in all this, my work was that, people really wanted to become data driven and companies really wanted to, and they would invest a ton in the people and the technology and, set up everything that they could in order to actually try to become data driven. But really where people actually fell short, or where sort of these initiatives to become data driven fell short, was when people actually couldn't trust the data. And they were like, wait, what are these numbers here? Where are they coming from? What is this asset? Who's using it? Should I be using it, or should I be using this other table that has the same exact name except V1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7? So many questions around trust came up. And I know that this was actually, perhaps the top barrier to actually become data driven. And so decided to start Monte Carlo to address exactly this topic and to make it easier for data teams to trust their data, thereby enabling the entire organization to actually trust the data. I'm originally from Israel, born and raised, moved to the Bay Area a little over a decade ago. And prior to Monte Carlo, I was VP at a company called Gainsight, which is a customer success company. So near and dear to my heart is sort of being customer first and helping data organizations wherever they are, making their lives easier.
Absolutely. Awesome. And just to kind of set the context, and I'm sure a lot of people have heard about data observability, but just to make sure if someone's listening, they haven't, can you maybe define what that actually means?
Yeah, definitely. So actually start by defining what data downtime is, and that will help understand the solution to it. So data downtime is basically periods of time when your data is wrong, inaccurate, or otherwise erroneous. And this is a reality that happens to anyone who's in data, right? A pipeline breaks, or suddenly a report looks wrong. Your machine learning model, is no longer accurate. There's all these different things that can happen when you're dealing with data and data products. And this is a reality that, anyone in data sort of faces. And the root cause for that can be very many different reasons. It could be someone upstream that made a change to schema that resulted in a report downstream that relied on those upstream sources that's now unreliable. Or maybe this is a third-party data source. Lots of folks in fintech and e-commerce rely on third-party data sources that might have a change on their end. There's so many reasons for why something might go wrong in your data. Now, how do you actually manage that, right? It's very hard to assume that we can live in a life where we don't have any changes to our data at all, right? And so the way to sort of manage that is actually based on best practices that we can take from software engineering. In software engineering, the concepts of observability is very well understood. Some tools that enable engineers to use observability to manage the health of their applications include things like App Dynamics, New Relic, Datadog. And any engineering team would be crazy to try to manage your applications and infrastructure without something like that, right? Kind of insane to think that you would want to do that. You need to make sure that everything is up and running, and concept of 5 nines and all that good stuff, right? However, in data, for some reason, we've been totally flying blind, have no solution for this, and definitely can't understand the health of our pipelines without any solutions. And so this is kind of we call this the quote, good pipelines, bad data problem, where we've invested so much in the architecture and the infrastructure, and the pipelines are all sort of best of class. But the data itself that's powering that, our products and that's actually running the pipelines, it can't be trusted. And in that case, what if we took the concept of observability and apply that to data? What would that look like? Would that allow us to understand the health of our data by observing it? That's the concept of data observability, actually understanding the health of your data by observing the outcomes of the data itself.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think when you look at the software development world, they have the SRE, the DevOps roles defined, making sure the application itself is absolutely running efficient, CI/CD pipelines are in place, and then you have the data side where we're talking about really bringing that into focus, making sure that do you know if you have bad data just because the pipeline's working correctly, and now obviously you have to kind of address some of those concerns because just how much data is being consumed. I guess when you're looking at data observability and its kind of, evolution from where it's gone and where it's going, how do you think a team, let's say you actually don't really have a footprint, right, in terms of data observability in your organization, where do you start?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think a few years ago, if folks were asking like, what is data observability? Like no one has actually heard that term, right? It wasn't heard of. It's like kind of a weird term is that, right? And fast forward to today, it's actually, becoming more and more something that you're like, wait, we don't have this? How weird is it, right? How have we been operating without this, right? It's just kind of nuts. So I think for a certain degree, we've really seen sort of the market awaken to this, right? We're seeing more and more companies invest in data as a first class citizen. And we're seeing more and more data organizations actually have the sort of insight to invest in data observability. And I'll tell you why. Because the reality is that you're investing and wasting time on this, whether you want it or you didn't want it. As a data team, you're waking up on Monday morning and you get a notification that something is wrong. And then you're just going to spend 4 out of 5 days in the week wasting your time trying to figure out what's wrong with the data. But what if you flipped it on its head and actually invested in data observability so that your team doesn't have to go running around in these fire drills? And actually figuring out how to move from being very reactive when it comes to firefighting data problems to being proactive about them. And so, to your question around like, where do I get started, right? And so what we see is one of the questions that I typically get is like, who's actually responsible for this, right? And I think people would love to sort of throw it over the fence to someone else. But the reality is that, both data engineers and data analysts and data scientists, and really any team that's involved in data is responsible for this and has its own part. And what we have to figure out is how do we actually allocate and sort of differentiate that ownership between each team. So I don't think there's a particular, or let me say this, in some organizations, there's a particular person who this is their responsibility. But even in those cases, it's really up to everyone in data to have data quality, data lineage, data governance, data observability be top of mind and be sort of at the forefront of your agenda. It's really, really hard to generate trust in data and to actually make use of your data in your organization if you're not putting it front and center.
And that's the interesting thing. I mean, it seems like everyone is actually spending resources on this problem, whether you're aware there's a proactive option, a proactive door, and you're dealing with this on a reactive basis, you're still spending your team's available bandwidth of doing other activities and dealing with this observability factor.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. In my career, I've worked with hundreds, if not thousands, of companies and have not heard of anyone who was able to hide or run away from data downtime. If you have, please do let me know. I need to talk to you. But no, seriously, ranging from earliest startups to most advanced companies when it comes to data, like Uber and Netflix and Facebook and Google, right? All these companies have invested heavily in data observability because of what you said. It's a reality that is just your day to day as part of your data teams, whether you are acknowledging it or not, whether you admit it or not. We're all data downtime experiencers, for sure.
Absolutely. And I guess you mentioned obviously, you're dealing with this solution one way or the other. If you were going to, let's say you were setting up a observability component to your data practice and you're selecting a tool, and obviously that's a whole different discussion. We'll leave that for now. But let's say you selected a tool, who on the team is probably best fit to actually own that product? Is it the data engineering team? Is it somebody on the more of the ops admin side?
Yeah, totally. So we've seen a few things. First of all, we've actually kind of taken all the sort of companies that we've either worked with or talked with and sort of actually plotted them on a maturity curve, if you will, from sort of starting from being really reactive. And we're just like literally waking up to your daily fire drill, spending most of your time on sort of data downtime issues. The second stage is proactive. When you actually understand there's a problem and you're starting to put something against that, it could be something really sort of basic and manual. It could be just a check to look at like null values, for example, or just check at like number of rows or something like that. So something that's like, pretty manual to set up, and you can set it up for like one or two pipelines. And, that's probably done by a data engineer who's been burned too many times by data downtime. And then the third stage is actually, we call it automated. When you're starting to realize that something that sort of cuts across your entire team and something that you want to actually not spend manual time on setting up. And in those cases, you sort of look for sort of automated solutions to do that. And then the fourth is what we call the scalable stage or scalable phase, in which you're actually looking for a solution that are not only automated, but actually scalable themselves. And, can scale them across hundreds of thousands of tables, numerous different data warehouses, et cetera. In all of those cases, typically who we see the ownership is in the data engineering, actually. The data engineering by itself, by the way, is a role that has emerged in the, I would say last few years. We've seen the rise of the data engineer, right? There's been a couple great blog posts on the rise and fall of data engineer a few years ago, which were really inspiration to me when we started Monte Carlo, which I recommend taking a read. But that role, we've really seen, and there's more and more of those kind of taking ownership of data observability. And then I would say the other role that's really important is the data product manager, which is also a new role that we're seeing. So as companies actually recognize that data needs to be managed as a product, that you actually want to treat your sort of digital product and your different data domains as different products with owners, you actually need a data product manager to help facilitate that. And often in those cases, we see, the first or second priority is actually to figure out data observability, since, you want to make sure that folks who are using data can actually trust it.
And that data product, on the side note, that data product manager role is so new that if a company is looking for one, they're typically trying to find someone who's done it. And there's not many people that genuinely have that expertise, which is really interesting.
Very, very true. What we've seen, and oftentimes it's either sort of product managers who've worked, on data products, or not necessarily have data in their title, but their expertise is with digital products that are based on data. So they've sort of de facto worked with data in those cases. And then in the other instances, sort of folks coming from different disciplines who want to move into data and into product management. In those cases, they might be mentored by more experienced product managers or by a more experienced data engineer, but folks actually coming sort of more from the area of data engineering, from analytics, et cetera.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's tricky because productizing data is just becoming bigger and bigger, and everyone wants to get their arms around where it's going. And yeah, that role is becoming really integral. I guess when you're starting to look at the data product manager, you have data engineering, they're both kind of responsible for observability. To kind of touch on whether you're going to look at that as potentially a centralized function, right? So obviously, you could embed these teams within different, groups in the company within different products, or you can actually centralize and deal them as a service to the rest of the org. And obviously, we can tie it in with the component of observability, because I think, who's responsible for each of those components becomes really interesting. How do you think that plays out?
Yeah, great question. And that is, sort of the question of sort of, should we have a centralized team? Should we have embedded folks, right? It's something that I think a lot of folks grapple with. There's also kind of the concept of data mesh. I'll throw in a buzzword, which I think also is related to sort of organizational structure and centralized versus decentralized platform. And I think this is all related to it. I think the bottom line, the trends that we're seeing that's powering this discussion, there's a few trends. One is there's just more and more people who care about data and have their hands in data, right? And so ranging from data engineers, data analysts to, ML engineers to executives, many people in the company actually want their hands on data. And then, the second is we just have the complexity of managing data has become, way harder than what it has been a few years ago. We actually have, people actually, sort of querying different data sets and using them to make decisions. And if you don't really know where that data came from and who's using it and why, it becomes really, really hard to trust it. And so because of that, the question of how do we actually organize ourselves to facilitate that is becoming more and more important. And so we're seeing some organizations who start out with having, one or two analysts and sort of like a centralized function where all questions go to those couple of analysts. Then you'll slowly see them, getting this just flooded by requests, right? From marketing to finance to sales, everybody wants something, right? Has some questions. And then, typically you're like, okay, get into the backlog and they'll talk to you in a year if you want something from us, right? That's when you start asking yourself, okay, this doesn't really work, right? And so in those instances, we often sort of see people kind of having analysts embedded in each team. The pros of that is that, every team has an analyst that can work with them on their needs and their domain specific questions. The cons of that is that there isn't sort of a centralized function that actually leverages the best practices that you'd want to see from, for example, data reliability, data governance, data security. And so, sort of the next phase or the end game, if you will, that I see is that there's sort of the best of both worlds, if you will. So there's also kind of the centralized organization, and it has different names. It could be called the data platform. It could be called, data engineering, data governance engineering. It could be called, just really, really different names that we've seen. But generally, it's sort of kind of a centralized function that sort of aligns on some standards for how do we actually manage our data, manage our data. And then on top of that, there's sort of domain specific teams that sort of own different parts of different data products, if you will. Some related to finance, for example, some related to R&D, some related to product in particular, et cetera. And so in those instances, you actually see teams kind of, both having the benefits of the centralized function and also having the decentralized ownership. And we see companies really fluctuate from all of those. I don't think that there's sort of a silver bullet or something that works best for everyone. But certainly the question that I would ask to begin with is, what are the main problems that you have right now? Is it that your centralized team is overloaded with questions and you need to sort of think about a different model? Or what is the problem that you're actually solving? And then work backwards from that.
Yeah, that makes sense because obviously, with just talking about the observability factor, you'd want that centralized. You want those best practices, but yet, when you talk about those analysts and they're out, talking to business and trying to gather requirements, understand the demands on the data engineering team. I mean, the data engineering is such a difficult role to fill, anyways. Whether you could even align that to a particular product is even a bigger challenge, just because that hiring component of having enough of them, that itself could be a constraint, to be honest.
Yeah, for sure. I have a lot of empathy for data engineering teams, everything that they're going through. And definitely, most data engineering teams that we speak with are either hiring or need to hire or are going to hire. I don't think there's anyone, I've seen very few are actually not in that. And, I think lots of folks ask for kind of any tips and tricks for hiring and, obviously kind of working with, sort of agencies to help amplify that is certainly something that we see across our companies. And I think, sort of the definition of what a data engineering is also changes, right? Similar for data scientists and data analysts as well, right? Kind of the different definitions and different skill sets required vary a lot. And so, yeah, it's a great time to be in data engineering if you want to work with data.
Yeah, I think where DevOps was maybe 3 to 5 years ago, the data world has found itself in these new positions between data engineering, the new data analytics type of person, which is armed with Python now instead of just SQL, and then the data platform, the product. I mean, they're all just so new and maturing that I don't think anyone can ever say they've got a handle on it. And then trying to add in the observability to have people be proactive actually might help your team become more efficient, actually get more done, because obviously, anyone who's ever done anything reactively knows you're trying to solve and find the problem first. Whereas if you know where it's coming from, you actually might, find some efficiencies there.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think if you were sort of looking at, the data engineering space outside, you'd think that we're in total chaos, right? Like there's just so many things happening. Everyone is hiring left and right. There's, like lots of new roles. You mentioned SRE earlier. We're trying to see DRE, so data reliability engineers, right? And so many tools, so many companies, so many startups. There's like so much happening. I do think that we are fortunate that we can follow the tracks of software engineering, right? To your points, like we're actually seeing these patterns. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel and we can sort of see the best practices that have really supported engineers in the last couple of decades and actually use them to our advantage. So I'm very happy about that. It's great chaos, but we can also sort of leverage that to move faster, right? And to catch up with software engineering. And I think that's an important movement that we're seeing.
Yeah, I think I had somebody on talking about this, and I think I personally view it as DevOps is becoming a part of software, and then now data is actually moving into that same world where data is becoming a subset of software engineering. Whereas before we always thought about traditional BI, and BI didn't get to solve the problems we wanted to, and data science and analytics came about. But I think it's becoming really a component of software engineering. That I think you're going to need to be more of a software engineer more than ever, 5 years out, to be able to execute a lot of this stuff on the data side.
I think that's right. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One, most of the products that we're building in software engineering today are actually data products.
Mm-hmm.
And when our product is down, our website is down or whatever it is, it's actually often because data is down. I'll give you an example. In 2016, I believe this was, Netflix was down for 45 minutes, which is a really long time for Netflix. And it was down actually because of duplicate data. That's a significant, instance of data downtime. And imagine the revenue implications of that, let alone sort of the resource and, data engineering that went into that. And that actually sort of spun this whole new sort of work stream around how do we make sure that never happens again. And there's some great sort of, blogs about what they did and what they built since. But that's just, an example of how data downtime is becoming more prevalent for all of us. And you're right. I think we're moving into sort of software engineering as kind of the way to address and solve that. And I think the other major reason is that if before data was really confined to BI, if you will, and it was only kind of a handful of reports that people were looking at once in a blue moon, like, oh yeah, let's go check out how much revenue we have or how many customers we have. We haven't done that in a while. Now people make real-time decisions based on that. It's no longer hidden. And also it's like thousands of people in organizations that are actually making decisions based on the data. It's not just, confined to one or two people on the finance team. And so just the reality of our world is such that we can no longer get away with what we've sort of the data downtime that we've had so far. So I'm excited to see us kind of, move toward resolution of this in light speed as we're seeing the industry move quickly.
I was going to say, thanks for coming on and talking to us about this. I think it was really interesting conversation. If somebody does want to reach out to you to further, pick your brain or talk to you about observability, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Yeah, so welcome to reach out on LinkedIn or Twitter, or actually you can also reach out to my email. It's Barr, BARR, at MonteCarloData.com.
Awesome. Definitely appreciate your time. Thanks for being on and discussing this with us.
Thanks for having me, Amir.
Absolutely. And that's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different guests, different topic. Until then, ask for two things. One, if you found the podcast useful, please share it. That's how it's been growing. So it's been fantastic. Thank you for that. And the other, if you want me to talk about something with a upcoming guest, feel free to message me on LinkedIn and let me know what you want me to talk about. And I'll hopefully get a guest to talk about it. Until next time, thanks.